This week, the international focus of the war has shifted from Gaza to Columbia University and UCLA, and it is spreading. A wave of protests hits American universities. We will focus on that, and also the question of a hostage deal, again, 7 months into the war. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. It's Unholy, two Jews on the news. We're back from, an unusual Passover break. We talked about it beforehand, how this year was different. And now I'm looking at the calendar, Yoni, and I just see there's, other big days ahead of us. Some meant to be joyful, some meant to be somber, but all of them now look different. Even just when you look at the kind of dates ringed on the calendar, they look different. When you look at them through the lens of, as you said, 7 months on from October 7.
Yes, I mean, it was a very unusual, I think, and sad Pesach in a way, right? Every sort of line of the Haggadah echoing October 7th. And now, as you say, we are looking forward into the Israeli calendar, soon Holocaust Memorial Day, and then the Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers and Independence Day, all in the shadow of October 7th and the war. It's going to be a very, very different Independence Day this year. Celebrations very much muted. I remind you that even last year we were talking about a very complicated Independence Day in the shadow of a society torn apart by the judicial reform. Really, little did we know, I can't stress this enough, little did we know that this Independence Day will be even worse.
Yeah. I mean, it's always a strange whiplash thing, the way Israel moves from Yom HaZikaron to instantly, Memorial Day, remembering fallen soldiers, instantly in a heartbeat, it turns into party time, Yom Ha'atzmaut. That's always been weird. In my view, it's a thing I can't think of in other national calendars.
It was, of course, Ben-Gurion who wanted it that way, right? To remember the price we paid for freedom and for independence.
No, there's a logic to it, except it's hard to do. It's when you actually do it. That's anyway, as you say, last year, a country tearing itself apart. Now this year, very hard for any. I think the Day of Fallen Soldiers will fit the mood, but to do the Yom HaZikaron remembrance, that fits the mood. But to move into a party time celebration, very difficult. So that's ahead. We're going to talk lots about those campus protests. We've got some really well-placed guests to speak about it with, students who are on the ground. The brilliant writer Hadley Freeman's going to talk to us about that. So we'll get onto all of that. But the action on the ground has been very much about the diplomatic front and whether or not there is going to be, and you and I have both become very skeptical about any talk of breakthroughs and so on, because so often there's been expectation and speculation and it's not come to anything. This time, briefings from the Secretary of State, from the Americans, saying Israel has made an extremely generous offer. That was obviously very well coordinated. The British Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, echoing it as well. That was a message. And then even reported via the Egyptian press, a kind of leaked version of what the terms of the deal would be, breaking it down into phases, talking about a 33-day period in which there would be one hostage released, I think, in sequences anyway, and then moving into a second phase and a third phase, really detailed. I thought the leak, again, perhaps significant to add pressure on Hamas so that the world will say to them, look, this is a great deal, you should take it.
Yes, I mean, we seem to be stuck in the same place for a very long time, right? Some sort of suggestion or deal on the table. The United States, Qatar, Egypt, all pressing Hamas. Israel essentially saying okay for the framework of this deal only to release for the sole reason, the important reason to release 133 Israeli hostages, and then Hamas making Israel, tormenting Israel as much as possible, making it wait, and then saying, you know what, this deal is not acceptable to us because it needs to say specifically that Israel will stop the war and withdraw all of its forces. Essentially, most of the forces are not in Gaza anymore. There are, as you say, different stages here. The first stage is 33 hostages what is called the humanitarian category, although we have to, which means the sick and the elderly and the women, the young women still there, 19 are still there. Although we should say, and I'll quote Sharon Cunha on this, she was kidnapped with her husband and her two young daughters. Since then, she has been released in November, and her daughters too, but her husband is still held. And she said, I realize that the first category will be the humanitarian category, but at this point, everyone is a humanitarian case. We have seen the videos, Hamas being terribly cruel and sadistic in releasing these videos of the hostages themselves, showing a sign of life to the families, but also the families realizing just how dire their situation is, how thin they have become, how malnutrition, how it is an urgent thing to call for their release. So there's a lot of pressure put on the Israeli government, but we should stress again and again, it is now Hamas that is waiting on this and not yet released its answer. At the same time, of course, I said pressure. So on the one hand, you have the more moderate side of the coalition, Gadi Eisenkot, saying we have to make a decision not based on political threats, and I will not stay in a government that makes these kinds of decisions. She, of course, refers to the fact that the extreme right side of this coalition, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, are threatening Netanyahu that he must enter Rafah or else. By the way, Ben Gvir being as brazen as doing this, threatening Netanyahu in a video filmed in Netanyahu's office. That is how much he realizes he holds the power of this government. So we are still stuck in the same place we were, which means either turning into Rafah or waiting for a hostage deal.
Yeah, I thought that video was really telling, and it was visual confirmation of something critics of the government have said, which is this is Ben Gvir's government. This is, in effect, a Kahanist government. But Netanyahu is enthralled to that group, to Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. He cannot move without their support, and they do not want a ceasefire. They do not want an end to this war before, in their terms, the battle is completely won, Hamas destroyed, Rafah conquered, as it were. He is between these pressures. Joe Biden, on the one hand, saying, you have to stop this. We're going to hear about the domestic pressure in the form of these campus protests. He's desperate for this to stop. It's really hurting him domestically. He needs this to be in the past tense. And he's putting everything on that. And then, on the other hand, Ben Gvir and Smotrich do not want it got ended. Who would you put your money on? I mean, in terms of who Netanyahu in the end listens to, is he going to take the pressure from Washington and bow to that? Or does he think that Smotrich and Ben Gvir hold his political life in their hands? My sense is he doesn't cross them because he cannot bear the prospect of them walking out of this government and therefore triggering the end the end of everything, which brings elections which remove him, or the return of that threat of him going to jail on those corruption charges. So I think he's caught between them. But in effect, Ben Gvir was right with that video. He's the man in charge.
Well, first of all, we have to make clear, if Ben Gvir leaves the government, it collapses. If Gadi Eisenkot and Benny Gantz do, it doesn't. Just pure on that level.
Absolutely right. That's why they're the more powerful hand.
They're definitely the more powerful, and they're playing their hand very well. But if you can try, right, to analyze Netanyahu in the most cool, collected way, right? Because it's very hard. He's like Trump, right? Many people will say you either love him or hate him. But the one thing he hates to do, and this we can tell based on his decades of political career, he hates to decide. He has been trying to kick this can down the road for a very long time. But as you say, on the one hand, the pressure of his far-right coalition. On the other hand, it's not only the president and Blinken and everyone else saying to him, you can't go to Rafah in the way that you're describing it to us. This will not only ruin the chances for a hostage deal, this will ruin the chances for Saudi normalization in the near future. It's also the threats of the weapons embargo. And please remember, it's the threat of the ICC, right? That has become a very prominent threat in this recent week, that the ICC the International Criminal Court will put out these warrants to arrest Israeli leaders, Netanyahu included. He is so worried about this, Jonathan, that we reported, our diplomatic correspondent, Yaron Avraham, reported this week that he actually turned to the hostages' families, who, let's say, need his help more than he needs theirs, and asked them to petition in his behalf in front of the ICC so they will not put out these warrants. This is a real concern. So I think that when you ask about the pressures on Netanyahu, they're growing every day, and it's very difficult to say at this point what fork he will take in the road.
Yeah,
that was a very long way of answering your question with, I don't know, Jonathan.
We don't know, but I was saying that if I had to put money on it, I think in the end he cares about Ben Gvir and Smotrich's support more than he does Biden. I think you're right about the ICC and how that hangs over him. Early nominee for our Chutzpah Award, really, for the man who has delayed on the hostage family, on bringing the hostages home, who has failed to really meet them properly, to counsel them in the way that, for example, Joe Biden has. The chutzpah of him then saying, listen, I may not have got your loved ones back, but do me a favor. I mean, what an absolutely outrageous cheek. But I think but you're right about delay. It is a hallmark of his career. An old politics tutor of mine used to say, delay is life. It is so often what motivates politicians to try and delay things, but the crunch has to be coming soon. And that's certainly what Biden wants Netanyahu to realize. He wants to force a decision from him. Your point about the various carrots that are offered to him, if he does go ahead with accepting this deal, and of course at Hamas at the moment, we're waiting for them, is expressed very well by, friend of the podcast, New York Times columnist Tom Friedman, who says Netanyahu and now confronts a choice, Rafah or Riyadh. Those are the paths. Either he walks into Rafah and alienates the Washington administration and its potential Sunni allies in the region, Israel's, or it takes a different path. And that path is not just the end of the war on hostages coming back. It's a whole different future for Israel involving formalizing that alliance we saw a couple of weeks back, where, the Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, all of them, some tacitly, some explicitly, joined together to defend Israel against that Iranian attack. Make that a real alliance. It's a very big prize. But you're right. His nature is to just get through another day. And the thing that stops him and frightens him is those two politicians walking and ending his coalition.
Yes, and I think I feel like I should make another point pretty clear. Look, Israelis, and not only on the far right, I think most Israelis after October 7th thought Hamas should be eliminated. I think it's a sad truth that we need to admit 7 months into this war that hasn't happened yet for all sorts of reasons. One of those reasons, not all of them, but one of those reasons being Israel does not have a clear strategy on who the alternative governance in Gaza should be transferred to. And if that is the situation, then many people in Israel are, on the one hand, saying, yes, you do need to eliminate Hamas, but wait a minute, why are you telling us that just Rafah and then we'll be done? Because obviously that's not exactly what we have been seeing in the last 7 months. So there are a lot of questions coming out about how this war has been run. I think it's also important, if we are mentioning Itamar Ben-Gvir, to remind our listeners again and again that this is a man who is the only party in this coalition that objected to the first hostage deal back in November, meaning that he thought that more than 80 Israelis, women, children, the elderly, should not have been reunited with their families. I think it might be a good point to stress that out as well at this point.
Look, at some point, somebody is going to have to be very honest with the Israeli public and say this idea of total victory and removal of Hamas is for the birds. It's not going to happen, and it hasn't happened. It's not just that it hasn't happened yet. Even if you went into Rafah, it's not going to happen in that way, in the sense that you can see it already. Areas that were sort of dealt with, Khan Yunis or in the north of Gaza, Hamas popped back up again. We heard it from Amos Harel when he was on the podcast. Others have said it. I think it is a kind of delusion, this total victory slogan. And the criticism that I think is in some ways most powerful of Netanyahu is the one that is neither left nor right, but has said, where is the strategy? There isn't a strategy here after October 7th. Yes, hitting Gaza hard, hitting Hamas hard, but a plan for who might actually govern there. Realistically, he says no to every option, even the revamped Palestinian Authority option pushed by Washington. There is no plan. And so what? It's going to be just this empty, lawless vacuum Somalia, or Hamas are going to be back there. You've got to start engaging with those realities. The same spirit that you identified, the same trait you identified of avoiding decisions in Netanyahu is avoiding even thinking of these things. And the result is that I think there will be a sentiment once this war finally is over of what was that all for? Because there has been a marked absence of a clear and realistic strategy from the beginning. So the conflict has always been a global one in the sense of the arguments that have raged around the world. That has been taking physical form in the last week or more on the campuses of America's elite universities. Started most visibly in Columbia, in New York. It spread really violent scenes at UCLA, where the pro-Palestinian encampment there was broken up and disrupted, apparently by supporters of Israel. A lot of people now claim and counterclaim, saying this is no longer students, it's outside elements coming in. And this huge dimension of it, which is the decisions of university heads to call in the police, and thereby conjuring up memories, by the way, which are actively sought by the pro-Palestinian protesters, memories of those clashes in the 1960s, over then the Vietnam War. One side saying we are the heirs to that anti-war tradition, the other saying you're like kids raiding the dressing up box and you're just cosplaying the 1968 protests. We're going to hear from this from people who are right there on the ground, students, and also Hadley Freeman, who's written about it. But I'm curious because it's obviously been a big issue which has gripped people outside. But in Israel, Yonit, are people paying attention to these demonstrations thousands of miles away about a war that they're living through directly?
Oh, completely. It's dominating the news here. And when I said that at the beginning of our show that the sort of focus has shifted from Gaza itself to what is going on in the universities, definitely. Even on our news broadcast here in Israel, this has been the focus of the discussions. You mentioned, you called it the pro-Palestinian encampment. I think it is important to say that some of these elements are more than that. They are clearly pro-Hamas and clearly very not only anti-Israel, but anti-Americans. I mean, that needs to be said when you look at this, because I think these voices are really troubling. And what we have seen basically since October 8th to this point is something that Israelis are really, really, really concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the protests just adjacent to Columbia, just outside the grounds of Columbia. So, who knows, were they students or were they outsiders? But some of the chants they were, issuing on the lines of, we want justice, you say how, burn Tel Aviv to the ground was one slogan. Another one, Hamas, we love you, make us proud, take another soldier down, all this stuff, which is, and we'll get into it when we talk about it with our guests, but very noticeable shift that these slogans, the demands, are not actually the old ones of the left, which were end the post-1967 occupation, let's have a two-state solution. Instead, one explicit chant I heard, on myself, I wasn't there, but I've seen the recordings of it, is we don't want no two states, we want all of it. These are students in New York saying this, as if speaking on behalf of the Palestinians, but speaking from a maximalist extreme position.
I couldn't agree more in the sense that they're, as you say, they're not shouting two-state solution. They say anyone who's saying two-state solution is now a boomer. It's outdated, right? They're shouting from the river to the sea. They want it all. And to me, and I think to many Israelis, what's heartbreaking here is the delegitimization of Israel's core right to exist, right? I mean, is Israel imperfect? Yes. Can it be criticized? Certainly. But how do you jump from that to thinking that Israel is worse than Iran, is worse than Myanmar, is worse than Russia, is worse than China? You should inspect anyone who thinks that, either their intelligence or their motivation. There is a country on earth, Jonathan, that executes women for not wearing a hijab, or gays, or rappers. That's Iran, to say nothing of its exporting terror. No one is attacking Iranian students in Colombia. No one is saying that Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, doesn't have a right to exist. And in that sense, we had, a deal with the world. Okay. And after thousands of years of exile and persecution and attempts to annihilate us, we return to our homeland and everything will be okay, right? That is the rationale of the Declaration of the UN from November 1947. Jews return to their homeland. The state of the Jews has a right to exist. That argument has been settled. Let's move on. And the fact that we are still here, I think, has taken us so much by, Jews and Israelis alike, taken us so much by surprise. It can only be compared to the surprise of October 7th itself and the unpreparedness we all feel in feeling this. I don't know if you agree with anything I said, but just in the sense of that is the thing that is so concerning and dispiriting and heartbreaking. It's not about the Green Line, settlements, 1967, a Palestinian state. It's so far beyond that. It's the question if a country has a right to exist and if its people have a right to exist. I mean, how has this been twisted to this extent?
Yeah, no, I do agree that has now become the question raised by these people protesting, and that they are not in the business anymore of addressing what I would refer to as the occupation. As far as they're concerned, the entire thing is an illegal occupation, meaning Israel itself.
Having said that, neither I nor you are sitting at an Ivy League college right now in the United States experiencing this. So it was important for us to talk to two students and to hear from them, to Jewish students, what they have been feeling vis-a-vis everything that has been going on.
Noa Fay is a senior at Barnard College, which is the all-women college at Columbia, and in the first year at the School of International and Public Affairs there. Maya Ilany is an Israeli graduate student at Harvard in the Kennedy School of Government.
And we're so glad to have you both on Unholy. It was really important for us to hear a little bit about how is life for you in the last couple of weeks as we see these college campus protests erupt. So first of all, thank you so much, both of you, for being on Unholy.
Thank you so much for having us.
Pleasure to be here.
And I want to start with you, Noa, just because maybe Columbia was a little bit higher in the headlines these past couple of weeks. Tell us a little bit about how it's been for you.
Oh, gosh. I mean, it's very hard to know where to start. At this point, things have just gotten so insane that really the main thing to comment on is just the state of affairs in our school, which is to say, that state is the closest that I've ever been to anarchy. We have first of all, the press has been here for a very long time. They're just absolutely swarming all of Broadway. Before campus was closed, there were points where they were getting in and, which is totally fine, of course, but it just really contributes to this environment of chaos and everything. But then on top of that, and the more important distinction is that there has been a very significant police presence, which again, we will totally get into, but it has really, made things feel quite difficult. And that is, of course, in conjunction with the fact that we now have checkpoints to get to and from classes in just various spots on campus. And at this point now, things have gotten so severe that we're actually not allowed to go into campus if we don't live there. So even though I'm a student here, I'm not allowed to get to the part of campus where we have certain dining halls, certain libraries, our fitness center, because I'm not a residential student in that area. And the same goes for other students who are not residential in other areas as well. So things have just become very chaotic, and it's been a very difficult, and everybody tosses around the word unprecedented, but really on college campuses right now, it is definitely unprecedented, at least from our perspective. So it's been a wild ride for sure, to say the least.
So Maya, it hasn't been quite as hot in Harvard from how it looks from the outside, but a whole different thing again, because you are an Israeli. I'm just wondering how that works, being an Israeli on an Ivy League campus in this moment. How does that feel?
I think that being an Israeli anywhere in the world right now feels pretty bad, to put it mildly. And I want to say I was listening to Noa now, and I also heard Noa's interview on CNN before, and it echoes what I heard from friends at Columbia and other campuses across the US. And it sounds absolutely horrible, and my heart breaks, and it fills us with fear here. I have to say that at Harvard, I don't know if to say so far, or maybe it won't develop as it did at Columbia. I went to the encampment twice now and spent hours there, conversations with people that were very difficult, but I did not feel threatened or any concern for my physical or emotional safety. Did I see slogans and political ideologies that I completely oppose to and think that are wrong? 100%, and I argued with them at length. But I've also identified from the start of the conversation as an Israeli, not that I could hide my accent anyway, and as a Zionist. And some people had stupid opinions, and some people were curious. And I really hope that it would continue in this atmosphere of nonviolent and civilized civil disobedience. But I really worry about what Noa and others are telling us about what's going on in other campuses.
I assume, Noa, that you're getting like friends and family from all over kind of asking you if you're okay. I mean, just this sort of, and I know from experience, you shouldn't just think of everything you see on the news as the exact thing that is happening, but I would say that it looks quite, frightening from
absolutely,
afar.
absolutely. And I have everybody who's asked me about it, I have told them, I say, whatever you're seeing, it's worse. And I do believe that, especially as I have heard now that, with all this, with this age of, technology and disinformation and all the things that people are talking about, I have learned that, because we're all on different algorithms, there are actually a lot of people who have not seen some of the most severe cases of anti-Semitism on this campus. So that's why I've always stressed to people that it is absolutely, it has just been horrific. And this is also to say that I have family in Israel, and my family in Israel, they are messaging me about how I'm doing and if I'm okay and if I'm physically safe. And which is just, that has just been mind-boggling for sure.
And when you say that a lot of people will not be aware of some of the worst things, I think you're right. And people, including people listening to this, so just give us 2 or 3 examples or illustrations that you feel convey the atmosphere for what it's like to be a Jewish student in Columbia right now.
Yeah, so I think the starkest examples that I think people need to know about is, first of all, there have been protesters on this campus who have told us with their own words, we are Hamas, we are pro-Hamas, we support Hamas. That's number one. We have students who have shouted at and chased Jewish students, telling them to go back to Poland simply because they were just standing beside the encampment with their Israeli flag, showing that we have a strong Jewish presence and that we're not cowering and everything. So there have been instances of that. There is also, I think this has to be the most known example, and if it's not, that's a problem. There was a student who held a sign that said Al-Qassam's next targets with an arrow pointing to the Jewish students who were standing just with the Israeli flag, singing Hatikva. And those are just a few examples, and that's not even including the violent examples that we've seen, which students have been spat on. Friends of mine have been spat on. People have thrown rocks at Jewish students. They've stolen students' Israeli flags and tried to set them on fire.
We're talking, a lot about identities. We talked about Maya's being Israeli, and I think we'll go into that a little bit more. You were both Jewish, African-American, Native American. How has that changed for you? I mean, the people around you, how has that changed the relationship to you at all after October 7th? Have you seen a kind of change in that?
Well, so there's definitely been, irrespective of identities, there has been absolutely a change in how people are responding to me simply because I've never not been a proud Zionist, but I guess, the climate has changed such that that's no longer tolerable even a little bit. So just because of that, people have totally, my friend group has changed quite significantly, and people treat me very differently. Even people I'm not super close with, but I'm an RA, and so I know a lot of people, and even people I greet by name, they actively turn away from me. They're either actively ignoring me or they are staring me down intently, simply because I am Jewish and I support the Jewish state. So that's been the overall change, but especially in terms of how this all relates to my identities, no one conveniently has spoken about how I have said that my existence is proof against what they're saying, which is that Israel is a white settler colonialist state and that Jews are all white supremacists. No one has deigned to comment on that, which I have interpreted to mean that, first of all, I think they know that they're incorrect. And secondly, I've just really taken it to mean that I don't have the support that I really did have before I emphasized the significance of my Jewish identity. And honestly, it helped me to learn that all of the support that I was feeling was all tokenization. It really, really was. I was only uplifted because I have fit their narrative of whoever they like to lift up, which is anybody who's Black, anybody who's a woman, anybody who's Native American, and all of those other identities that they have deemed worthy of empowerment. But when I say, oh, by the way, don't forget, I'm also Jewish, and that's a significant reason to uplift me, that's not a reason for them. And in fact, it's the opposite. It's a reason to totally drop me.
I can imagine that it's very confounding for them. I'm looking at you on this call now, and you're a Black woman with an Israeli flag behind her. And I can imagine there being some students at Columbia who just, who do a sort of double take and don't know how to work that out when they see that. But I wanted to put this to you, Maya, because it's something I've been wondering about even before this eruption of protest. It relates to what Noa was just saying, which is the notion that the Black Lives Matter movement, even at the time, actually, was sort of transposing what it saw as the battle lines onto the Middle East conflict. And so it decided that kind of Israel is, the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department, and the Palestinians are analogous with Black Americans, and therefore we know exactly where we stand. It's not complicated. This is just quite literally black and white. That there's been a sort of read across, and then that might partly explain some of the intensity of what's going on now. What do you think of that?
I think it's quite ironic that in the name of fighting imperialism and colonialism, a lot of students here, some of them are my peers, are just copy-pasting a narrative they know as the sins and the wrongs of their history onto somewhere else. I'm not saying that you can't see any parallel lines between different wrongs in history and in different places, but the idea that everything is the exact same problem everywhere you look is just intellectually lazy and stupid, and at times also anti-Semitic. But it's mostly, I have to say, it's mostly just stupid, because if you care about the people that live between the river, the famous river, and the sea, and you want them to live in peace and prosperity, then getting the right analysis is crucial for that. And that I did see a lot of. I can't read into people's hearts and minds. I can only guess, but I think it's laziness. And as an Israeli, I have to say, at Harvard so far, and I can only speak of my own experience, and I don't doubt for one moment that other Jews and other Israelis might have completely different experiences. I felt mostly the social impact of people they were your friends and now they're not anymore, or they want to do a litmus test for you, an ideological litmus test. Are you the right kind of Jew? Are you going to say what I want you to say, or are you going to say exactly what I expect you to say? That exists. I would say there are two groups. There's a group that is definitely driven by hate, by conspiratorial thinking, anti-Semitism. They were there before Israel was created, after it was created, before October 7th, and after. Sometimes they're more galvanized, sometimes they're more quiet. There is a group of people who I think are seeing images from this war, and they're not fully informed, yes, but they're not necessarily driven by hate. And you can have a conversation with them. It could be a very, very difficult conversation. But for me as an Israeli, I think that casting everyone as people who are hateful and just want to kill me is a mistake, not because I want to defend them, but because I care for Israel and other Jews. I led actually the only student delegation that arrived to Israel, a student delegation from an American university during the spring break last month. We took a group of around 20 people. In normal years, there are hundreds of students just from Harvard and thousands from all across the US that travel to Israel. And this year we were the only ones. And the fact that people came along, people who are not Jewish, and many of them, I have to say, would not be automatically pro-Israel, if you want to put them on that camp, but came with an open mind and were curious, and I respect them for that. And I think those of us that have the energy, it's important to engage when you can And I know that many times I myself don't want to get out of bed and I'm running out of energy.
Is there a moment that you can share with us from that delegation, that's something that you saw, that's something that moved hearts and minds, that changed something?
Sure. There were so many, but I can say that when we visited Nir Oz in the Gaza border region, we were led by the son of Oded and Yocheved Lifshitz. Yocheved was the first hostage to return, and Oded Lifshitz, former journalist, is still in Gaza, still in captivity. Unbelievable. And their son, in a very kibbutz kind of way, told us about his parents and how they fought for peace, and his dad being a journalist. And you see their home completely burned. I mean, unbelievable. And I remember one of our participants came up to me and said, why did Hamas attack here? Why did they attack the most peace-seeking people in Israel, the kind of people that could have bring peace? And you could really feel and hear almost the penny dropping in their head. And the realization at the end, and again, this comes from people that were more pro-Israel and from the people that came to this trip from the more pro-Palestine, where they say at the end, I realize you can't speak about liberation for Palestinians without speaking about safety for Israelis. And you can't speak about safety for Israelis without also speaking about freedom for Palestinians. I was like, okay, I don't care which protest, which flag you hold. If this is what you think, then I'm okay with you, and we can have a conversation. Mm-hmm. And I think there are people that are worth this investment. But maybe I'll be proven wrong. I'm not giving up for now.
It's a really interesting thought, this, about how you can connect with and make this argument. Clearly, what we've seen recently means it has to be done differently. And your experience suggests that might be a way to do it. Noa, I want to just put to you something that people have said a lot about Columbia and the other university protests, which is, you keep telling us, they say that this is an unsafe environment for Jews, but we switch on the news and there's pictures of tons of Jews at this encampment. There's people wearing kippot and wearing a talit. I can see your reaction.
She was expecting this question, Jonathan.
And they do a Seder last week. And so what's the problem? This is clearly a lovely environment for Jews. What do you say to that argument that so many Jews are participating in the encampment? What does it say?
Okay, so it's not that I was necessarily expecting this question. It's more just that we've all given a lot of thought to it, because I think it's over 80% of Jews are Zionists, which is to say that, at least amongst my friends, we're all collectively very confused by these people. And so that's why I was saying I won't try to, break down their psychology or what they're doing there or anything like that. There are people who, could do that and whatever. But in terms of our perception of them and how we should be thinking about them, I absolutely stand by what I said. We should take them as seriously as we take blacks for Trump or gays for Trump, which is to say that as we also don't understand what's going on with these Jews supporting this anti-Semitic movement, I, as a black person, have no idea what's going on with blacks for Trump. Like, nobody can explain that. It's just weird, and we don't really know what's going on. This is not an exclusively Jewish problem. In any group, there are always people who disagree, and especially in the context of, an existential crisis or something like that, there are always people who, they have their own motives, but they don't believe that the group is going about things in the proper way. And so they try and take control and do it themselves. Now, I think that this is, similarly what we're seeing with the Jewish students in this encampment. I don't know why they're doing what they're doing, but I will also add that they are lucky that the rest of us are not going to allow this to get to a point where they are forced to realize the hard way that they are only accepted right now because they are rejecting what broader society has identified as Jewish, which is, in this case, in this era, it's Zionism. So they have said, we're not Zionists, we're Jews. And the broader society has said, okay, well, if you're rejecting what we have identified as primarily Jewish, then that's fine. But if this continues as it is going, we will get to a point where things develop such that this broader society identifies not only Zionism as Judaism, but we get to a point where even if you're a Jew who repudiates Zionism, you're still a Jew. Again, we are not going to let things get to that point. We are a very, very strong community at Columbia, a strong Jewish community at Columbia. But I definitely think that is the situation.
I really hope we don't get to that point, and we're a lot, very, very far from that. And it's exactly what I wanted to ask both of you, if I can. How do we move forward from this? What needs to happen to bring back the genie into the bottle? I mean, maybe the fact that the school year is going to be over soon might calm everyone down. But besides that, what should be done to make you more safe on campus, Noa, to add to your attempt at having discussions, Maya? What needs to happen for this to be a better environment for you both?
I'll go ahead. I think we all share as Jews, and I would like to think that as students and members of academic communities, that free speech and arguments and investigations of difficult questions are not a problem, but something we embrace, an opportunity. And I definitely didn't come to Harvard only to hear stuff that I already agree with or think. So we all want free speech and we all want to express ourselves safely. I think it is a problem where we have people who embrace violence or hate or conspiratorial thinking. They're not helping us advance arguments or to ask difficult questions and have hard conversations. I think the reason some of these movements have taken up so much oxygen and so much space is because maybe cool-headed people that are more reasonable and fair and have integrity avoided having certain conversations that were difficult because of the heat, because they were worried about the pushback. And when we leave a certain arena, there would be no vacuum. Someone else will fill it in. So I think one of the ways to deal with this situation is not to escape from it and try to shut down all conversations, but the opposite. Try to have as many other avenues for proper, fair debate where all the difficult questions can be asked without any threat to someone's identity and without any hate.
Yeah, I agree. And I will add to that I think dialogue is absolutely the first step. And the problem on campus is that we are not having dialogue because those on the anti-Israel, part of the anti-Israel opposition, they do not want to talk. We have tried repeatedly over the course of the entire academic year, and they have continuously rejected any attempts to incur dialogue. And in fact, at Barnard specifically, there have been countless opportunities for dialogue established by the administration specifically. And the students have not only not attended, but the anti-Israel students have actively boycotted and protested those attempts at dialogue. And furthermore, there was an event with my dean of SIPA, Karen Yarimilo. She's an amazing, oh my gosh, I just love her so much. She's fabulous, fabulous woman. And so she's Israeli, and she had at an event with her counterpart at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, who their dean is Palestinian. And they had a discussion. It was lovely. I saw the whole thing. It was great. But during that time, the anti-Israel students were banging on the door trying to stop this dialogue from happening. So that's a large part of the issue. And in fact, that's part of why I personally I'm very concerned mostly about, Yonit, you mentioned putting this genie back in the bottle. I'm very concerned with how to reverse the damage that has already been done, which is to say the brainwashing, frankly, that has already taken place in my generation, not only in terms of the content relating to Israel, but just in terms of the brainwashing regarding how we operate as people and how we behave towards each other and what values we have. So it's a little bit grim because I don't totally have an answer, but I definitely think that it, first of all, starts with dialogue. So we have to attack things on that front, but also, it's specifically in the university setting, there has got to be a curriculum change. I mean, seriously, I don't know. I'm not saying shake up the entire thing, but at the very least, there's got to be an introduction to anti-Semitism or Jewish people or something like that in our core curriculum, which is, Columbia is famous or sometimes infamous for its core curriculum because it is very, very rigid. And I think they absolutely need to introduce a course that discusses not even necessarily just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I think anti-Semitism overall, because part of the issue is that people don't understand that this is anti-Semitism at its finest in every single way. And I am absolutely done with this bizarre discussion of whether or not this is anti-Semitism. It is anti-Semitism. We know it is. And we will get to that answer every single time, no matter which angle we come at this from. So the fact that people cannot learn that and understand that on their own, that's kind of the main problem. And I think that's what a curriculum change needs to attack.
I'd like to add to that. Noa, I don't know if this was part of your program at Columbia. I can say that at the Kennedy School, all the master's program also include either a whole course or just a few sessions about diversity, inclusion, race and racism, which I welcome. Like, you could never be educated enough about this stuff. And the Kennedy School is very proud to have people from all over the world from different walks of life and different experiences. And I welcome the opportunity to learn about the history of racism and hate in different places. I would also welcome if anti-Semitism would be part of that curriculum.
I agree,
which
100%.
It is not. I know the Jewish groups on campus asked the administration directly to include it and were refused. And I think maybe Jonathan would recognize some of it from the British experience, but I've been active on Israel-Palestine issues in the UK from within the Labour Party and the trade union movement, so very left-wing circles. And I feel like Groundhog Day here in the US. I see the same errors that are being done, which is to treat every concern that someone makes about anti-Semitism as a bad faith accusation that was meant to smear the just cause of Palestinian freedom. And instead of listening and reflecting and thinking about maybe we have a problem or a vulnerability on this, the response is always to double down and deny. Now, if there's any progressive American Palestinian freedom fighter listening, I would ask them to look at what happened to Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, reaching the worst defeat the Labour Party had since the 1930s with that state of mind. And I would say, not just as a Jewish person or as an Israeli, when people tell you that they're scared and they're hurt, it's never wrong to think if maybe you can do something differently.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good note on which to wrap this up. I mean, what you've said, or what you've both said rather, some real pointers for how things can actually be done and improved out of this situation, rather than just, lamenting it. So we're really grateful to you both, Noa Fay and Maya Ilany. Thanks for being on Unholy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much for having us.
I am so happy that Noa and that Maya came on. They are so impressive, and what they have to say is so important. And I'll sort of pick up on the last sentence that they said about how anti-Semitism studies is not part of the core curriculum in these Ivy League institutions, and how that is such an important part of the problem. This doesn't, by the way, start in college. It starts even in middle school and even before that. If you don't teach people this, how do you expect them to even understand a lot of it? So I think that is incredibly important, but we don't want to leave it only at that. And we want to kind of expand our lens and talk a little bit more about this problem, the problem that we have been seeing in campuses in the United States and beyond that.
Hadley Freeman is a columnist for the Sunday Times here in London, previously a colleague of mine at The Guardian. She was named Columnist of the Year at the British Press Awards just a week or so ago. Author of an acclaimed family memoir, House of Glass, which shed light on the experience of French Jews in the Holocaust. But very relevantly for our purposes, she is the author of a new essay in the latest edition of the Jewish Quarterly. It's called Blindness, October the 7th and the Left. Hadley, really good to have you on Unholy. Delighted to have you.
Thank you for having me.
We have been hearing from a couple of students on American Ivy League campuses. We've been, everyone's been talking about that around the world. In a way, it's part of a wider phenomenon that you lay bare and seek to analyze in this essay. And we should say it's almost kind of book length. It's 20,000 words. It's a really serious probe into this whole phenomenon. You describe a sense of surprise about the left's reaction to October the 7th that you had and that others had. Describe what that reaction was, that blindness that you identify, and what about it there was that surprised you?
I was surprised at how callous people I know and people I could see around me were about the murder, the rape, the attacks on the Israelis on October the 7th. I mean, by the evening of October the 7th, I could see people on social media cheering it, defending it, explaining it away, and things only got worse over the week that followed. And although you and I, Johnny, have written a lot about, for example, labor and anti-Semitism, and we saw a lot, maybe I experienced more surprise than you during that era. I was shocked at how some people that, we consider in our political tribe reacted to the Jeremy Corbyn era and denied the Jewish experience, that what they saw in front of them was anti-Semitism. But I was really surprised that people who pride themselves on being anti-racism, anti-bigotry, anti-violence, anti-victim blaming were really so callous about the suffering of the Israelis on October the 7th.
First of all, I have to tell our listeners to read the whole piece. You put so eloquently, I think, everything that we have been feeling since October 7th. If I could just quote one line, you say, when progressive left identity politics takes you to a place where you are jazz-handing away the rapes of Israeli women by fascist Islamists, maybe you should ask yourself if this movement outlived its purpose. Can you help us break down what happened? Like, how did we get to this point where this is happening?
Well, my father says, that we've been coming to this point for a long time. As he says, there's always a game of tag and the Jews are it. He is very, very gloomy about all this, I must say. He's 85 and has lived through various iterations of anti-Semitism in his family in France and in Israel and in America, where he grew up. It's a strange thing, I think, for those of us who grew up in America, particularly me, like in New York, to see New Yorkers. I mean, we see now at the Columbia protests. We saw the day after October the 7th, the protest in Union Square against Israel, to see New Yorkers turning against Jews and Israelis like this. And I think, personally, it's been a while coming that there's been this desire to find a group to demonize, to see as bad. And I sort of lightly allude to this in the piece, that there is a desire on the left to find someone who they demonize. And for a while during the whole gender wars, there was women who they could suddenly turn around and shout at and blame for feeling physically threatened by male people in their spaces. And now it's Israelis and Jews who they can shout at for feeling threatened by terrorists in their country. And I find it extraordinary, being both Jewish and a woman, to see how demonized I am on all fronts of my identity, really.
I mean, I want to give people the benefit of what you do in the piece, because you do try to analyze and give offer two or three sort of explanations for this, because there are a lot of people around who are just kind of lamenting it and are distressed by it. But what you're doing is actually trying to explain why the shift might have happened. I think it'd be really useful for people to hear that. So you say that, first of all, for one thing, a big change that came after October 7th is you were very used to, in the British left or the American left, both of which you know very well, people attacking the occupation that's happened since 1967. You saw a move where people were now attacking not just that, but Israel itself, its very existence since 1948. The placards talking about 75 years of occupation, so suddenly away from 57 years. And you offer a few reasons. I just want to see if we can go through a few of them because they're very illuminating. First is this big shift on the left, you say, away from class and towards race as a defining or animating or organizing principle. That's perhaps the better way to use it. Just tell us about that. Explain that to us.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I mean, certainly at The Guardian, I started in 2000, and the big discussions there often were about social class and how that related to politics. And at some point in around 2010, 2012, the shift focused to race, and the British left followed the American left on that one. And there was a lot of importation of ideas about race from America to Britain, and the idea that what American people of color suffered was the same as what British people of color had suffered. And the left became less interested in class politics and more interested in identity politics. And it became a very simplistic way of looking at things often, which was that dividing the world between the oppressors and the oppressed. And never can there be an overlap between. And of course, there are overlaps between. There can be, of course. And things are not simplistic. They are not Marvel movies. And during 2020, when people were locked down and just staring at the internet all day, everyone went a little bit nuts about identity politics. And with the murder of George Floyd and this great racial reckoning in America, and there was a certain kind of, importing it wholesale onto British politics in ways that it wasn't always necessarily appropriate. The British experience of race and British experience of racism is quite different from in America, not least because in America it's often bound up with social class. In Britain, things can be more complicated. And Jews became at the losing end of that. Suddenly, as David Baddiel has written in his book, Jews were seen as just super white in a sense. They were ultra-capitalist, ultra-white. They could pass. They were deceivers. They were trying to bring down the left for their own benefit. That was the kind of argument of the Corbyn era. And then after October the 7th, things really blew up, and people in America and Britain on the left really see what's happening in Palestine and Israel as a very simplistic recreation of white versus black in America, or black versus white, I should say, which is just not appropriate. It's the ultimate form of colonialization, I think, to impose one's own politics, one's own Western experience onto countries in the Middle East.
So Jews become the ultra-white, and then there's a crucial rule that you point to, that the Jew is never the victim, so the Jew cannot be hated. But then October 7th happens, and Jews are very clearly the victim of a massacre. Then what happens? Because you need to twist your thinking a little bit more to make that fit into what you have just described.
It's really extraordinary. I mean, this had been building for a while. We saw in America, for example, during the Women's March, there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism coming from the organizers of the Women's March, who turned out some of them were followers of Louis Farrakhan. So there was already this idea that Jews are oppressive and Jews will try to play the victim for their own benefit. And that was already coming out of America. And also on the right as well in America. We saw during the Donald Trump era with the Jews Will Not Replace Us march. So it was on the left and the right. And yet it is extraordinary to me, this selective blindness in America, as well as here. But in America, it's not that long ago since there was the shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue. And nonetheless, you have people like Susan Sarandon saying during the protest, well, now Jews know how Black people feel. As though Jews are totally ignorant of what it is like to be in fear of your life or to feel oppressed. All of us have grandparents who experienced, the worst oppression really imaginable. And so it did take huge leaps of thinking. And so the leap of thinking was, as Johnny says, that Israel in itself is illegitimate, and therefore what Hamas did is legitimate.
I mean, you quote that Susan Sarandon line. I think she said Jews know what it's like to be Muslim
sorry.
In America.
Yes, of course.
And you think, and you rightly point out that given everything that Jews had, in fact, Jews are targeted more in terms of racial attacks or religious hatred in the United States. I think you write this, you give the statistics that they are the most targeted group in the United States, and yet Sarandon saying that. Just on there will be some people listening to this, I think, who will be saying, yeah, I completely I'm with you on the reaction to October the 7th, on October the 7th. But now, 6 months later, aren't all these people in New York and Columbia and Harvard and UCLA and everywhere else, aren't they protesting about what Israel has done since, about the 33, 34 or more thousand dead? Aren't they not showing blindness to the suffering of Israelis on October 7th, though they did, you're right about that. But actually they're reacting and they're just distressed and upset by the images they've seen since. How do you address that?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's interesting to me that there is no acknowledgement from many of these people of the Israelis who are still held hostage. Secondly, of course, there's horrendous suffering among the Palestinians. There always has been. And yet no acknowledgement from these people that maybe Hamas could have done something to mitigate this, to take an action to protect its own people, given that Israel's reaction, while many of us might abhor it, criticize it, whatever, it was entirely predictable. You wrote several columns, Johnny, predicting that this is what was going to happen after October the 7th. And lo, you are the Mystic Meg of The Guardian. So it has happened. And also no acknowledgement that I do agree with what the Peel Commission said back, I think it was in 1938 when it was published, said that there is right against right and also wrong against wrong. Neither side is wrong in this, but both have terrible people involved in reaction. I am not pro Netanyahu. I am not pro Hamas. And yet too often we see these videos of students at UCLA, Columbia, chanting literally pro Hamas. Chants, saying that Zionists are not allowed in certain places. There's a complete incomprehension of what Zionism is, a complete incomprehension of the history of Israel, and a total lack of interest in learning about any of these things that I think is very telling. And the idea that they can just, dump on Jewish American students or dump on Israelis for that matter with impunity because it puts them on the right side of history is both wrong and I think dangerous.
There's a question that's been sort of swimming around in my head for a few weeks now, and I think you're sort of uniquely positioned to answer it because, can we say you're both American and British?
Yep.
And the fact what we're seeing in Colombia, the violence, the pro-Hamas protests, we're seeing less of that in Europe and in England. We've seen demonstrations, but not really on campuses in this sort of volume. Why is that? Why is that different?
I think there is a tendency among young people to want to be part of a movement. And I think there is this idealization in America of those anti-Vietnam campus protests. And there is a sense of wanting to recreate it. I mean, I still feel that a lot of the passion behind the gender movement among young people was them wanting to have their civil rights movement, them wanting to have their, pro-gay rights movement, and Stonewall and the ACLU and other organizations really convinced them that the trans rights movement was the same as the gay rights movement, when of course it's not. And similarly, Gaza is not the same as Vietnam. Things are much more complicated, but there is a kind of nostalgia in America of looking back to when the great period was. And there is this idea like the 60s, that's when true passion was, that's when young people changed things. And I think there is this weird kind of mimetic effect.
It's so interesting this because I think you're right about that, and it's conscious. I mean, a lot of the imagery and everything is taken from that, and yet you also describe a kind of amnesia among today's left, and particularly perhaps younger generations. You write at one point that young people today do not associate Israel with the Oslo Accords, let alone the Holocaust. They associate it with Netanyahu, meaning their memory goes only 10, 15 years max. I don't mean memory really, I mean knowledge.
Yeah.
And that and therefore this notion of that Israel, I'm going back to this point about the founding, that the founding may have come out of something that wasn't just colonialism, like, the English deciding they wanted tea in India, from, and deciding to colonize, but instead was out of a need, an existential need. You write, can refugees be called colonizers? But your point in a way is that the people protesting, or today's left, don't really see or remember that Jews were ever refugees and needed a place to live rather than just, going there out of some sort of imperial impulse.
Well, nostalgia is always self-serving and always very selective. And I think particularly for Americans, there's this extraordinary phenomenon really of mid-century Jews in America in that they did entirely assimilate and yet also managed to import certain traditions onto very major industries. Like you just look at sitcoms, even of the 80s and 90s. There's this real kind of Yiddish vocal rhythm that came straight from Mel Brooks, Woody Allen to Seinfeld to Friends, like this really yada, yada, yada. And the Americans who aren't Jewish look around and they see who are Jews? What are Jews? They're like Harvey Weinstein. They are Sheldon Adelson. They are big, rich figures. They do not associate Jews with poor, desperate Europeans, being shipped off to the camps. So it's very hard for them to make that connection between Jews as oppressed, Jews needed a homeland. What they see is big, rich Jewish figures, sometimes with not great reputations like Harvey, and now Netanyahu, or people like Donald Trump saying he only trusts Jews to do his taxes, and now beating up on poor brown people. That is how I think a lot of young Americans see it.
We talk, the piece obviously talks a lot about the blindness on the left, the progressive left to be specific. Let's talk a little bit about the blindness of the Jews themselves, which you discuss as well. First of all, I think sort of the haunting line of this piece is, how did we not realize how hated we were? And you do talk a little bit about, maybe I can call it anti-Semitism denial, right? How Jews convince themselves, wait, it's not, they don't hate me. They hate Israel maybe, but it's not me they hate. That it took a while for Jews to wake up, and maybe October 7th and October 8th was a terrible wake-up call to that, to wake up to that realization as well.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to believe it. Corbyn was a good, shake out of my sleep for a little bit. But it was really when I came out of my synagogue, I write about this in the piece, having picked my 3 kids up from Hebrew school on Saturday. And there was this bus parked outside, draped in Palestinian flags, and people on the bus shouting at us and honking their horn and saying anti-Semitic things to us, that I really realized then, I thought, oh, this is a problem. Whereas before I just thought, people are, self-serving. They are just pretending not to see that labor has an anti-Semitism problem, or they think there are bigger issues. Okay, I can understand that. But when you have this kind of hate in your face, I remember I took my kids, cause I work on Sundays or have to work for a Sunday paper. I had to take my kids into the office on Saturday, which sometimes happens, and getting the train back home on the Northern Line after one of those marches, and the whole train carriage was filled with people carrying placards. I'm not even exaggerating, saying, Zionism is racism, Zionist scum, Jewish money. And my boys are 8. My 4-year-old couldn't really read them, but my boys were just looking at me going, Mommy, what's going on? And we got off the train and got a taxi home. Like, it is scary. It's scary.
I'm wary of being one of those people who you describe as devoting a lot of emotional labor into doing exactly what Yonit was describing, which was trying to not face this problem. But let me give 2 potential pushbacks to the thesis and see what you think. One is the idea that this is unique. You and I both remember, people saying after 9/11, the Americans had it coming. So question, is this as unique as perhaps, readers of your piece are feeling? That's one. And then the other one is a sort of broader question, which is, we've been talking today on this episode with, students who are right at the sort of, on the front line on all this, and now speaking with you about it. Do students, activists, and the far left itself really matter that much? You've got Joe Biden in the United States yes. is in a very different place. Keir Starmer is thought to be the incoming prime minister in Britain. Again, he's a target of all these protesters because they feel he's too much with Israel. You look at other governments broadly around the world, they're all, broadly in the right place. Do we expend too much emotional energy worrying about people, with banners and placards? Then we should, because the people who are making the decisions are not in that place.
Well, I think on the one hand, yes. I live in Camden, and on my street, since I moved in years ago, there have been, banners in people's windows saying, free Palestine, and as well as some old stickers saying, free Nelson Mandela. I mean, there's that kind of that far left, and that's fine and they can do whatever they want. But, I spent a week at Harvard in March to write a piece about what was going on there. Turns out I chose the wrong university. I should have gone to Columbia. But anyway, I went to Harvard. And I talked to a lot of Jewish students there and Jewish professors, including Steven Pinker. And what Professor Pinker said to me was, students have always protested. That's not a big deal. But you have to remember that these people at Harvard are going to be in positions of power. And where once there was a counterbalance to their arguments and their professors would debate them and make them question their beliefs, that is not happening at Ivy Leagues anymore. And the fact that this is happening at Ivy Leagues, I think, is a problem because, like in Britain, with the Oxbridge stronghold over positions of power, in America, it's still places like Harvard, Columbia, UCLA to a certain extent, etc. These people do get in high positions and they're not being challenged. They're not children. They're, 22, 23, 25-year-olds. And if the fact that there's no pushback from the adults around them, I think is a problem.
That's such an important point, that these are people who will become adults and in important places very soon. And kind of leads me to ask, what can we do? I mean, you lay out the problem beautifully. There's a little bit of optimism at the end, really just a little bit. Yeah. But I mean, what can be done? What do we as Jews need to do now?
It's a very good question, because as Jonathan Haidt has written, who's this very interesting American NYU professor, on the one hand, you have these students who, what he calls the coddling of the American mind. If you question them, they feel attacked. And therefore they can say all these awful things and there's no questioning back at them. And of course, my great fear is that none of them are going to vote for Joe Biden. And then Jews will be blamed for the election of Donald Trump. And things just keep escalating and get worse and worse. I mean, I think the only thing is for intelligent, sensible people like the two of you to keep speaking up. So when you have sensible voices who explain things in a non-partisan, clear, historically aware way, people are interested in that. And I learned so much researching this essay, not least from Johnny, who helped me with it. And it is fascinating. I was fascinated to learn more about, the Balfour Declaration and all that era and what the British involvement in Palestine was in the 1930s and why they pulled away from Palestine in the 1930s. Like, all that stuff is interesting. And I don't think all young people are, ideological demagogues. I think a lot of them are open to listening. Some aren't, that's fine. But as long as people keep reaching out there in a non-ideological, just straightforward, honest, clear, intelligent way, I hope that it gets through.
Yonit asked the question about what should be done. And I wonder as well about what is being done. In other words, how Jews are reacting to this. In some ways, one of the most dispiriting lines is almost a throwaway line in your piece. You described that one of your neighbors removed the mezuzah on the doorpost. It's the traditional container of a little section of Hebrew text that traditionally Jews put on the doorposts. It's an outward sign of being Jewish, often actually by people who don't really do much else that's Jewish, but they do that. And that was a very bleak sort of omen, I thought, that someone was doing that. I mean, is that a common reaction? Do you sense that's what Jews are going to do, that they're sort of going to go underground as a result of what you're describing?
Well, I think there is a little bit of people being more cautious about going out. I felt it was a bit of a shame. There was that story in London recently about was it Gideon Faulkner? Is that his name, Johnny? You'll know better than me. Yeah. Falter, who confronted a protest while wearing a yarmulke, and the police, objected to him, saying that he was being openly Jewish. And there was this huge hoo-ha about it. And I rather wish that he had been straightforward and honest about it and said, yes, I went there to prove a point, because that point was legitimate, which is that it's perilous to be visibly Jewish on Saturdays in central London. Around these marches, you get directed away, instead of saying that he just was on his way home from synagogue, which wasn't true. I think it is fair for Jews to point out that a lot of us do hide certain elements of our Jewishness. On the other hand, having said that, the reason I know about my neighbor, and I probably should have included this in the piece, is because after October the 7th, the Jews communities in my part of Camden came together to form a WhatsApp group, which we call the Oy Neighborhood. And we now have community Shabbats on Friday nights in our local community center. And there's a much bigger sense of Jewishness in my neighborhood than there was before. And maybe that's not good. Maybe we are, to use an unfortunate term, ghettoizing ourselves. But we're still out there mixing, on Camden High Street. But there's a much greater sense of community, which has been really lovely.
And maybe I can add to that there's maybe a greater sense of connection between the Jewish community in Israel and the Jewish community in diaspora, which I hope that we contribute to that a little bit. But I think that is also important, that the connection has been, made stronger by this, maybe.
It's true. And I've been much more in touch with my cousins in Tel Aviv than I usually am, which is bad of me. But I'm sorry that it's taken this for us to be in more regular contact, because they are much older than me. They're my father's generation. But now we email a lot more, and it's really lovely, and, send photos of my children. So yes, it has brought us together, but at a terrible, terrible cost.
Yeah, that's for sure. I want to ask you a question from it's kind of left field, but it's completely different, but it has to do with you, I think, for more than 2 decades interviewing big culture figures and celebrities. I think you said that celebrities are always a little bit weird, which is a quote of you I love. Can't agree more. But anyway, to talk about actually cultural figures and the fact that we are sitting here and talking about in a week that Paul Auster has died. And I think we can agree, even if you read only a little bit of Paul Auster or a lot of Paul Auster, that the world is a sadder place now that his stories will no longer continue. You posted such a beautiful article of you, I think at 24, interviewing him.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about just, your thoughts on that, if we could, in this opportunity that we're talking to you, kind of hear from you on that?
I was so sad when I saw it yesterday. So yeah, he was my first big interview. And I was actually 23 when I interviewed him. And then the piece came out a few months later when I was 24. And I was so terrified. Of course, like all teenagers and 20 somethings, I grew up obsessively reading the New York trilogy, the Book of Illusions, the Music of Chance, Leviathan. And he really typifies, I think, like a classic kind of idea of New York Jewishness, in that he was totally not religious, like Woody Allen, like Jerry Seinfeld, but there's a Jewishness to him, undeniably. This very assimilated Jewishness, but assimilated in a way that brings Jewishness to America. And Auster, I think, often gets underestimated in this country, not in France, where they absolutely adore him. But in this country, there's a sense that he's someone you read in your 20s and then you move on from. And I think that's a terrible way to look at him. And it's not fair. I think his books are always fascinating. And he had such a sad final few years. People who sort of, read newspapers and stuff know that his granddaughter died and his son died. And, Paul Auster deserved so much better. He was a lovely, lovely man. And there's also something incredibly sad about him dying from lung cancer. Right after Amos, just over a year later, who also died from lung cancer. Christopher Hitchens, who died over a decade ago from lung cancer. Like that generation of writers who seemed so cool and glamorous, the smoking, and yet that is what takes them away too soon. It is really sad.
I'm very glad we talked about that too. It shows that you are a journalist in full. You don't just analyze and obsess about the Jews, but you are somebody who writes about the full range of culture.
About famous Jews.
And famous, lots of other people. And also about fashion, which we haven't even talked about. That's how you began. There's so much we could have talked about. Hadley Freeman, really good to have you on Unholy. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hadley.
So that essay is called Blindness. It's in the Jewish Quarterly, which comes out now from Australia. It's a publication with a long and storied history. Do track that down wherever you can, because Hadley's piece is really, really worth reading.
It really is. And I'm so glad that we had her on, finally. Did we actually agree that it was your fault that we hadn't had her on yet? I think it is.
I think you decided that, and
okay, good.
I'm long past the point of disputing those things with you. We have awards to hand out.
We do.
We the committee gathered and had, in its shortest ever session for the Chutzpah Award, it just took a matter of seconds. I'm sure some of our listeners can guess. The clip of this went viral immediately. This is a leader of the Columbia student protests speaking outside a building that they had taken over and occupied. And here's what she said.
Why should the university be obligated to provide food to people who've taken over a building?
First of all, we're saying that they're obligated to provide food to students who pay for a meal plan here.
But you mentioned that there was a request that food and water be brought in, unless I misunderstood.
To allow it to be brought in. I mean, well, I guess it's ultimately a question of what kind of community and obligation Columbia feels it has to its students. Do you want students to die of dehydration and starvation or get severely ill, even if they disagree with you? If the answer is no, then you should allow basic, I mean, it's crazy to say because we're on an Ivy League campus, but this is like basic humanitarian aid we're asking for. Like, could people please have a glass of water?
Really, what is a normal person to think in front of this concoction of, I don't know what to call it, support for Islamist, Marxist, anti-Americanism, but while doing all this while asking for Uber Eats? Like, how is this, how can this be the world we live in? This is just beyond parody. Do you remember that we had Muli Segevan, the editor of Eretz Nehederet, Israel's genius satire show, and they had a skit called Columbia Unti-Semity, where they talk to a Hamas terrorist and they call him our BFF. And it was satire. Now he doesn't even have to work so hard. He could just take this clip. It's mind-boggling. And I think it sparked, as you can imagine, 1,000 memes with people's, issuing demands for acai bowls and gluten-free food. The satirists had a field day with it until, of course, a document surfaced from the Students for Justice in Palestine at UCLA with their requests for supporters to send them items that were essential for the struggle, including vegan food, gluten-free food, and a list of requirements that were for food that would be specifically excluding nuts because people might have allergies and so on. So it is one of these things where art, life, satire, they are all meeting with the Columbia students' demand for what they, again, I think it's a classic bit of chutzpah, had the chutzpah to call basic humanitarian aid, as if they are going through some sort of reenactment of what is actually a very real and dire and serious situation in Gaza, rather different if you're in the center of New York City. Yeah, it's very rare to have someone just in one sentence capture something. I think it's David Frum who wrote on Twitter, "The revolution will be catered." When he saw this, he retweeted this. But just on a serious note, I mean, I know that it's so easy to mock this. I mean, we were talking about how these protesters take their sort of, it's a homage for them for the Vietnam anti-war protesters. We need to say when we make that comment and that comparison that the people who stood and had those and were behind those protests were fundamentally holding American flags. They were patriots. They thought America had lost its way and the war should end. But they weren't rooting for the Viet Cong, right? And when you say that you root for Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, that is incredibly worrying and something that we can't I'm sorry that I'm ruining the joke here, but I mean, it's not, at the end of the day, it's not funny. It's really a terribly serious thing. And as you say, it's not only belittling what is going on now in Gaza when you're sitting in Columbia University asking for humanitarian aid. It is just remarkably dangerous.
Though worth remembering what Maya Ilany did tell us, which is that this is true of some on the extreme fringes, but there are plenty of other kids who are at these demonstrations who are not in that place, who are not cheering and rooting for Hamas. They're distressed by what they're seeing on TV and they think they're doing the right thing. So I think, there is a brush and we probably should be careful of tarring all of them with it. But yes, the point you make stands. We should also hand out our Mensch Award this week, and I think in our conversation with Hadley Freeman, we did touch on it.
Yeah, I think we can't not give the Mensch Award of the week posthumously to Paul Auster, who is such a remarkable writer, not only in the sort of the originality of his stories and the way that he writes, sometimes more poetry than anything else. It is just so terribly sad that he is not with us anymore. I don't know, and I think in the conversation with Hadley, I don't know why my favorite book is his most depressing book, which is In the Country of Last Things. But there are so many others. I think this is at least an opportunity to reread some of them. Just a genius of a towering genius of literature, and it is beyond everything else that is sad. I think it's very sad that we're now living in a world that he does no longer exist in.
A worthy winner for our Mensch Award. If you have enjoyed listening to this edition and episode of Unholy, please do remember to rate and review. It really does help. Those 5-star ratings, which many of you are generous enough to give, mean that the podcast becomes more visible, and that means more people listen to it. So we are grateful to you for that.
We are, and we will say our thank yous to Gaia Glazer, Omer Primat, Omri Barak. A special shout out to Yuna Leibzon, friend of the pod, that helped us out a lot in this episode. She's our correspondent in New York. And Jonathan, I have a strong intuition that we shall meet next week.
I feel that too, and I look forward to it. See you then, Yonit.
Me too.